Hi, welcome to this video in which I will explain the features of my new instrument called NS-404. It's an instrument in my growing collection of non-temporary toolbox virtual instruments for Decent Sampler. If you're not familiar with Decent Sampler, it's a free sample player that you can download from the Decent Samples website. I link that in the description. And it's completely free, and it also allows for people to create their own custom plugins. So that's what I did. Let me load it up. So there we have it. This is the NS-404. I sampled this instrument from a device called Imaginary Friend, made by Error Instruments, a Dutch company that makes Eurorack and standalone noise devices and effect boxes. To me, they all sound somewhat the same, or rather in the same ballpark. And what they always lack is a decent pitch tracking. As you can see, there is a CV input on Imaginary Friend, but it does not track 1 volt per octave. If you don't know what CV or control voltage is, you can look at it as, at least when it's in regards to pitch, it's like the MIDI input on your synthesizer or Groovebox. If you don't even know what MIDI is, then you either haven't ever touched an electronic instrument, or you were born at least 3 decades after me in the era of smartphones and apps. And rest assured, you can run Decent Sampler, so this plugin as well, inside the iOS environment. Let me stop talking for a moment. I'll play you some sounds with the NS-404. After that, I will explain the features in a little bit more detail, and for those people that are interested in seeing how the code looks for something like this, I'll open up the XML file at the end of the video and show you a little bit of how it was constructed for this instrument. So in front of me, you can't see this. I have a big keyboard, and there's also a sustain pedal on the ground, which I will sometimes press down. So if you don't see these yellow keys light up and there's still sound, that's probably because I pressed down the sustain pedal. I will try not to, because it's a little bit confusing, but it's a habit and I'll probably forget in about 10 seconds. So let's reload a fresh version of the instrument, and let me explain a few of the features in more detail. So to the left here, there's this big custom switch, which is for the noise layer. Here you can adjust the level of the sub and the noise separately. I sampled every tritone. From C1 it goes down to G1. Then it's another sample that starts on F sharp 2 and it goes up to D sharp and so on. So if you play across the keyboard, there will be different noise samples. I tried to get them somewhat in tune, but it's usually not the point to be in tune when we're dealing with noise. So I switched to the second noise layer. Let me run through the different zones. In the middle here, I had to, well, it's different samples, but I had to use the same pitches because there was just no way the instrument was giving me a stable pitch at these ranges. So again, when you play some notes across the keyboard, you're getting different layers of noise. And the first noise layer is a bit more high. No, I wanted to say high pitched, but it's really more a higher, sharper timbre, while the second noise layer is a bit darker. Okay, so let me quickly play the sub. This was also sampled from the imaginary friend device. I think this is a triangle or triangle-ish. Again, the instrument I sampled this from does not track pitch, nor does it really stay stable. So I manually tuned, well, every tritone to get samples for the full keyboard. But I think it sounds rather interesting, and there's some noisiness that's just inherent to the device that I sampled it from. It just adds to the character of the sound. So let's bring up the noise again. I made a bandpass filter that's only filtering the noise layer. So it brings down the volume a bit, but it also filters out everything that's outside of the frequency range. So you can use this for sound design. And by the way, Decent Sampler works standalone as well. It doesn't have to be loaded into a DAW. And as I said before, it also works on iOS devices. The biggest reason I'm doing this in Ableton Live right now is just so I can easily record my voice onto a separate layer. That's the bandpass filter. Let me turn that off. And there's a virtual tube made with two impulse responses. So these are two convolution reverbs in chain with each other that are not behaving as reverbs at all. When you compare this to the original sound, I think you'll agree that this adds yet another layer of possibilities to shape your own sounds with this. Let's listen to this with the other noise layer. And you can combine the tube setting and the filter. And you might have noticed that the pitch is a little bit off most of the times. And this is because of the drift setting. I created, a virtual analog drift with two LFOs with separate frequencies routed to the tuning of the samples. And you can increase it. But what this also affects is the movement of the bandpass filter. So when you turn this up completely and you mix the sub and the noise, especially when you add in some reverb, which is also a very lush impulse response reverb, this really starts moving around. And this is a sound that I really very much enjoy. Then there's one more thing to tell you, and this is just the slew here. This is the attack decay or attack release envelope. When the slider is down, it's about 0.2 seconds for attack, decay, and release. The sustain is at maximum, by the way. Let's turn on the reverb. So this is pretty much immediate. And then when I turn this up, you get these, the instrument starts behaving more like a bad synth. And you can go up to 6 seconds. So that's it for my video on the NS-404 in the non-temporary toolbox range that I'm making. And I will have to see where I upload this instrument. It might be a free download from Piano Book, but I've been trying to contact Dave, who made the Decent Sampler platform, about maybe selling a few of my plugins on his Decent Samples shop. If I have any information about where to download this device, you can read all about it in the description box. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye. So here we are again. Let's have a look at my folder that contains all the files that are necessary to run a plugin with Decent Sampler. So first of all, if you click this here, then the plugin opens inside the standalone version of a Decent Sampler. If you want to be able to do this as well, then you need to rename what is first an XML file where the code lives. You have to rename this extension to DS preset. Furthermore, this is the folder where all of these files live. And if you want to be able to open this one straight from the library inside Decent Sampler, you need to add the extension DS bundle to this folder. So what might happen if you download sample packs from, for example, Piano Book, if you unzip those files, you'll often just get, well, a folder with a few unzipped folders in it. And if there's any indication that one of those folders is the Decent Sampler version of the sample pack, it's really just easier to add the extension DS bundle to that and drag it into a folder where you keep your DS sample packs. I already opened up the code, which you can see here. So as usual, I first started out making a UI. I did this in Affinity Photo. When I make these UIs, I add the knobs and the buttons just to see how much I can fit inside the window comfortably. And then I import this UI into my code, which you can see here. And then I start adding the buttons and the switches first. And I just try to overlay them to what's printed inside the file of the background. And then when I get the switches and the buttons aligned, and I'm talking about this big one, all of these faders and these switches, even these lights and this tube thingy here. So I line them up and then I go back into Affinity Photo, which is like Photoshop. And then I remove those elements from the static background image because I overlaid them with the code. And the code references separate files. Let me show you actually. So here are all the pictures. Yeah, that's this one. You can see this is just a PNG with a transparent background. And I made this in 2 versions. This really didn't need more animation. So the first line here is indicating that we're adding a button. The XY position is here, then the width and the height. And then because this is a button with 2 states, either on or off, or in this case, type 1 and type 2, you need to create those states for the button. You also need to write down what the button should do when you click it or even hover over it. And then you need to create bindings, but I usually do this afterwards. And these just tell Decent Sampler what to do when this knob or switch is clicked. So that's the first state. This is the second state, because there's one situation where you want to change the picture to the knob being on the left side. It also needs to activate certain samples and deactivate other ones. And then when you flick it to the right or twist it or turn it to the right, or in a case of a simple button or switch, if you switch it, and then you also need to write down all the parameters for that situation or that state. So again, what image to display, which samples to activate and deactivate. So I did this a few times. The bandpass on and off switch, that's this one here. It follows exactly the same logic, and the code is pretty much the same, apart from what the images are. So the actual PNGs. And of course, they don't activate sample groups, but they activate and deactivate an effect, which is the bandpass filter. And because this is a group effect, this is not a global effect, this filter only affects a part of the sound. So that's because there's so much written here. If it's just a global effect on the level of your instrument, this code will get shorter because you only need to describe one situation for every state. So the same thing with the tube on and off switch. You can see that with this code here, I actually control a static image, and by using this kind of code, you can make this light here for this image to change. It took a while for me to figure this one out, but it's really cool. I also used it for these lights here and for this LED. I find it very cool to create some kind of interactive element. It makes it feel more real to me. And well, in some cases, I guess that's something that I find enjoyable. So there's the tube light. When you're using a switch to change out a static image that's somewhere else on your UI, you also need to place that image first. So you can't change the path of an image if it's not already there. Then there's the faders, and as with all the knobs and buttons on this instrument, I made all of these myself. That was the challenge that I gave myself for this instrument. So the faders actually consist of, I think it's 80 frames. It took me a long time to figure out how to create sprite sheets so this sampler can actually read these correctly. Then there's the slew level fader. So I just made a general ADSR envelope with the sustain at max and a short attack, release, and decay. And then I use one knob, one fader to change all of these at the same time. I find that really easy and a quick way to interact with the sound. Then there's the reverb level fader. This just changes the amount that the reverb is mixed into the signal. There's the bandpass frequency knob. So this affects two groups of samples, the two types of noise. The drift knob, as you can see, controls the amount of modulation the LFOs are doing, and the parameters of these LFOs are here. So this is the LED for the bandpass. And then you close the tab section. Below here is the keyboard. This is just lowest note, the highest note, and the color that they should be. Then below the UI, there's the modulators. These are the LFOs. I made 4 LFOs, no, actually 5. There's one for the mod wheel that adds vibrato. And you can see that there's 2 LFOs changing the global tuning. They're really slow LFOs and they're not synchronized. And the one is global, so that's just one LFO across all the notes. And then there's the second one, which is affecting separate voices, which means for every note you press down, a new LFO is created. So this creates a lot of detuning that I really enjoy. And then there's a similar situation for the modulation of the bandpass filter. And these are just all bound to the one knob here called drift. So here you can see the global ADSR. Loops are enabled. I made these sounds, these samples loop inside Audacity. I just created a loop, snapped them to the zero crossings, and then kept searching for a loop that wasn't clicky at all. For some sounds like my modular synth, which always is a little bit drifty for some reason. Sometimes it's a bit hard to find the loop points, but I think it's worth it. So then there's the first group of noise samples. I tagged these. That's an easier way to remotely mute them or retune them or whatever by using tags. You can see here that the effect is inside the first group. Then there's the second noise layer, again with the same effect inside its group. And then there's the sublayer with no effects inside the group. So this is only affected by the global effects, which are here. So as you can see, there's 3 convolution reverbs. The first one is an impulse response from a Roland RE501 tape echo, but just with the tape, not with the echo activated. And then there's an impulse response of a rectifier by Mesa Boogie, a really powerful tube amp. And then there's an actual reverb impulse response that I made myself from some software reverb that I really like. And then here is the MIDI section. CC number 1 is the CC number for the mod wheel. The lowest binding here is just stating that the position of the mod wheel should affect the modulation amount for the first LFO with the 0 index 0. So that's the first LFO. And that LFO is bound to the global tuning. So this affects the vibrato. And then the first binding here actually increases the frequency of one of the LFOs that's modulating the bandpass filter. And that's it for this instrument. I realize this is a bit boring, but I guess if you have watched till the end that you don't find this boring at all. It took me about 2 to 3 weeks to really get my head around this coding. I started off making really simple UIs, which was very enjoyable. It gave me a lot of satisfaction to be able to upload those to Piano Book and see what the reactions were. So then I started by trying to create more complex structures inside the code to influence the way that you actually interact with the instrument. But I didn't use custom knobs or buttons. And now I've set myself the challenge to create actual custom knobs, faders, switches, buttons, everything else as well, which I think turned out great. So now I'll be able to come up with more complex structures and give them custom knobs, switches, faders, etc. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye.